Hello there. My name is James Gilmer. I'm the User Services Librarian at Tiffin University, and today's video is going to go over how to create an effective presentation with the idea that this will help you prepare for the Student Research Conference. Our topics for this session include just a general overview of the research conference and the format that that's going to be in, how that's going to be presented, when that's going to be, all the details of the conference. We're also going to talk about selecting an appropriate presentation format and software. There are a couple different programs that you can use to build your presentation, which will eventually be uploaded. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of those programs. We're also going to talk about how to build your presentation and structure it in a way that flows nicely and coherently, how to present that material in a way that's aesthetically pleasing and that is not distracting or confusing for your audience, and then how to present your work overall. Some tips about how to build a presentation. So the Tiffin University is holding our 6th annual research conference in December. It'll be December 12th from 6 to 7 in the evening. And the presentations will all be pre-recorded, so you're working on those now with the goal that they'll be available for people to view. They'll have already seen them by the 12th, and they'll be coming on the 12th for the Q&A session. So the presentations themselves, pre-recorded. You won't be interacting directly with the audience. You'll be presenting your material so that people can watch it on YouTube. And once those people have watched your presentation and seen your research, any questions that they might have, they're going to bring to that December 12th Q&A session. The keynote speaker for our conference is Dr. Marlon Harrison, who's presenting on Technicolor Third Space, developing the Autoethnographer Literary and Arts magazine. His presentation is already available on YouTube, and I encourage you to look at that and watch that to get an idea for sort of formatting ideas for your own piece. If you've never been to a research conference, this is a good opportunity to see how a professional scholar presents their materials and gain some insight from that in building your own. Okay, so those are the details of the conference itself. There's going to be a Q&A session, and your audience will have the opportunity to ask you questions about your presentation. But what will your presentation itself look like? So because this is a virtual conference, your presentation is going to be an oral recorded lecture using visual aids. And PowerPoint is the go-to. We're going to talk about some other programs that you can use, but your presentation should include slides like mine here that detail what you're going to talk about and help keep you on track, as well as graphs, images, any research findings that will help to illustrate your points as you present them. So you may have done a survey, or you may have collected information from other researchers, charts and graphs and infographics along those lines that you'll want to include in your presentation and upload that to YouTube for general viewing. So because this conference is entirely virtual, we're not going to meet in person for you and your audience to hear the presentation synchronously. Everything is done asynchronously on YouTube. Visual aids are going to be especially important if you have a lot of facts and figures that you're talking about. So numbers don't stick very well when you're talking to people just in an oral context. Having graphs that will illustrate that data, that will show those comparisons, are really useful in keeping your audience engaged and informed and making it easier for them to follow your argument. One thing to keep in mind, we're going to talk about this more in a later section of this presentation, is that you know your research very well. Your audience doesn't. So things that you just know from your research and from your experience with the topic and don't really think about needing explanation, your audience isn't quite there. They're not necessarily there with you. So it's a good idea to illustrate those things that you've learned over the course of your research so that your audience will be able to follow along. And then the Q&A session, as I mentioned, will happen synchronously on the day of the conference, and that will allow your audience who has watched your presentation on YouTube to ask you questions in greater detail about the research that you've conducted. All right, with all of that in mind, you've done the research, you've planned out the presentation, you know what you're going to say. How do you put it into a format that you can upload onto YouTube? There are a few different program options that will allow you to build a presentation, a slideshow like the one that you're looking at now, and that will allow you to record a voiceover. And if you've never done this, it's very simple, it's very straightforward, and by the end of this presentation, you'll know exactly where to go next. Our first option is Canva. And Canva is a browser-based presentation tool that requires a working internet connection to use. So what does that mean? It means that Canva is a program that lives in the cloud. You don't install it on your computer, you go to a website instead. You'll create an account there and you'll be able to work with your slides, upload your information, and build your presentation there. So the advantage of using Canva is that it is entirely web-based. You don't have to download anything. It's also free to use for most of its features. Like many of these free software options that we're going to talk about, there's a paid version that has additional features, but the base model of Canva, which will do enough in order to build your presentation, is free and has a good image editor that allows you to incorporate graphics pretty easily. Now the trade-offs. So Canva doesn't include the base free version of Canva doesn't include everything. It doesn't support PowerPoint files. So if you've already started building a presentation and are looking instead to add a recording to it rather than to start from scratch, Canva isn't for you. You're not going to be able to import your PowerPoint presentation that you've already designed into Canva. And that also means that Canva doesn't play especially well with other programs that we're going to talk about. If you start in one platform, and this will hold true for most of the things that we talk about today, if you start in one platform, you're not necessarily going to be able to transition into another very easily. Canva also, in my personal opinion, having tinkered a little bit with it, has a more limited set of options for building out your slides. It works, it's functional, but it's not the most intuitive and customizable experience. Okay? Canva does, however, have a built-in voice recording system, so you're able to do everything in one program. You can build the presentation, and then you can record the voiceover with it, which makes Canva a good option, although I'm going to argue not the best. Our second option is Google Slides. And any Google software you already know you have accessible to you through your Tiffin University email address because it's connected to Google. And so you get that entire suite of Google programs for free. Now, Google Slides is useful in building presentations. And actually, this presentation that you're watching now, I built the slides in Google Slides. However, and this is a pretty significant disadvantage, there is no built-in voiceover recording feature in Google Slides. So how are you hearing my voice connected to a presentation that was built in Google Slides? This is one of the trade-offs to Google Slides. You can do all the graphics work, you can do all the planning and layout work in Google Slides, and then you can download that presentation as a PowerPoint presentation. Google is able to export into a PowerPoint format. So although Google Slides doesn't allow you to record a voiceover in program, you have two pretty good options to allow you to get that voiceover anyway. You could record your voice separately and then merge the two through a process that will be outlined in another connected resource that we're going to put in the comments below. Your other option, and the better one, the simpler one, because it all happens in one program, would be to download your slides presentation as a PowerPoint presentation, and then use PowerPoint's built-in voiceover recording system to then add your voice to the presentation. Google Slides, like all other Google programs, requires an internet connection to work. So you have to be connected to the internet in order to use Google Slides. It does have the huge advantage that your work is saved as you do it. Google programs are fantastic in that sense that they automatically save. If your computer crashes or the battery dies or for any other reason you're disconnected from your work, you might lose at most a minute's worth of progress. That is very much not the case for other programs that you have to download onto your computer that we're going to talk about at length shortly. The next piece of software that I'd like to talk about is Microsoft PowerPoint. And PowerPoint has the advantage of being part of the Microsoft Office suite that you have available to you for free as a Tiffin University student. This is a set of programs that you download onto your computer, so it does live on the hard drive of your computer rather than in the cloud. That means that you have a saved file on your computer of any work that you're doing, which has advantages and disadvantages, right? It's very easy to move a saved file. It's very easy to make copies of a saved file and move them from computer to computer. You can put it on a USB drive so you readily have access to it. If you were leaving your workstation and maybe giving a presentation somewhere else at a conference or in another class, things like that, where you're not sure necessarily if there's going to be an internet connection. And that's the advantage and disadvantage of Microsoft PowerPoint and all Microsoft programs. Because they're installed on your computer, you don't need an internet connection to use them. Because they're installed on your computer, you also need to save your work periodically as you go. Microsoft has a built-in autosave feature that will catch some of your work if there's a power issue or the computer crashes or the program crashes, but it's much easier to lose a large amount of material in the event that the computer crashes or the program crashes than it would be if you were using one of the Google products. PowerPoint does, and this is the key advantage in my opinion, have the built-in functionality to add a voiceover recording to your presentation. So this presentation that you're listening to today was built in Google Slides, but could just as easily have been built in PowerPoint, and then was recorded in PowerPoint, which demonstrates to a degree how well the two programs work together. And then also demonstrates that I could just have used one program. I could have used PowerPoint to create everything. Now, with that in mind, I would recommend PowerPoint or PowerPoint plus Google Slides as the easiest, smoothest way to create your presentation. That doesn't mean that there aren't other options though. We'll talk about two more before we move on. So Prezi is our next option. And Prezi is unique. So the advantage of Prezi is that it uses animations and a non-traditional format. It's not a series of slides, but is instead more like a map of your topic, that you can jump from point to point and see further slides and also have a voiceover recording connected to it. So Prezi is visually different than any of the other presentation software options that we're going to talk about today. And it's free to use, and it saves automatically. It's also web-based, which means that while you can't use Prezi if you don't have an internet connection, as long as you do have an internet connection, you're never at risk of losing progress that you've built into your presentation that day. And on top of all of that, Prezi is going to set you aside from the other presenters who are using more traditional software. If you use Prezi, your presentation is definitely going to look unique compared to someone who's used PowerPoint, and that by itself will make you stand out. Our last software option is WPS Office Free. This is sort of a hybrid of Google suite of programs and the Microsoft Office suite of programs. Just like Google, WPS has built a clone, in essence, of Microsoft Office. So this includes all of the different Microsoft Office standard products, their equivalents in WPS. There's a PowerPoint equivalent. There's also a Word equivalent and an Excel equivalent. So worth checking out for those as well. But for our purposes, we're most interested in that PowerPoint clone. You install this on your computer, but everything saves automatically through a web-based client. WPS Office is also completely compatible with PowerPoint. So just like Google Slides, if I build my presentation in WPS Office, I can then save it and open it in PowerPoint to build that voiceover into the presentation. That's also the main disadvantage of this software, is that it has to be installed, unlike Google and Google's suite of programs, which exist entirely in the cloud. WPS is a sort of hybrid system where things are saved in the cloud for you, but you do have a program component that you have to install on your computer. So it's a little more complicated in that sense. With all of that information in mind, what presentation software is going to be the best fit for you? Some things to consider when you're trying to answer that question include: what software do you already know how to use? If you have experience with Microsoft PowerPoint, that's probably the best way to go, is just to stick with what you're used to. The other consideration is accessibility. So if you know you're going to be working on your presentation, let's say on more than one computer, maybe you're going to work on it for a little bit at the library, you're going to work a little bit on it at home, you might work on it at a computer lab on campus, you're kind of just, whenever you have free time, you're working on your project. You could save that project on a flash drive, carry it around, and use PowerPoint to tinker with your presentation. But that requires each computer that you work on to have PowerPoint, which may not necessarily be true. A good option, if you plan to work on your presentation at more than one place to kind of bounce around and work on it as you go throughout the week, could be Google Slides, because you always have access to those Google programs. They save your work as you go. So if you anticipate maybe working on your project and your presentation in between classes, Google Slides is a good place to build the presentation and to build the visual aspect of it, to then save on a computer and add that voiceover later. The most beginner-friendly software, incidentally, is also Google Slides and Microsoft PowerPoint, mostly because you probably have experience, if not with those specific programs, then certainly with Google and with Microsoft, and the way those programs are built will look similar to things like Microsoft Word or Google Docs that you probably have more experience with. If you try out a brand new piece of software, that's adventurous, but be prepared for that to take a little bit longer as you learn the software first, and then you do the work of building your presentation. What elements should you include in your presentation? You'll want to make sure that you have the title and the purpose of your project clearly laid out. So the title you've already provided as part of your submission process for the conference, and then the purpose is likely included in your abstracts. You want to make sure that you touch on both of those things. You're next going to want to include the information and results from your research. So what was your hypothesis? How did you test it? What sort of data and evidence did you collect? What were your ultimate conclusions based on that research? This is essentially going to map out your argument. What are you trying to prove? How did you go about trying to prove it? What did you find to support your argument? And what does it mean that your argument is, as far as you've been able to prove in your research project, true? You also want to include your contact information, so your name, email address, and your major or program. And this will help people who maybe can't attend the Q&A session but do have questions for you to reach out and ask questions about your work. You might also find that there is someone who's working on something very similar to you and has ideas that they'd like to share. And those sorts of scholarly connections are one of the biggest goals and purposes of an academic conference. You're going to go to an academic conference and you're going to meet people who are working on the same thing as you. And they're probably approaching that topic from different angles, things that you might not have considered before, and your work might bring new perspectives to theirs. So those sorts of connections and idea mapping and branching are one of the biggest takeaways of an academic conference. So with that in mind, what is your presentation actually going to look like? How is it going to flow from one piece to the next? For this, we're going to talk about what goes on the slides and also what you're going to say in your oral presentation, at least in the broad scope of things. You want to start out with your introduction and an abstract, and this is maybe 2 to 5 sentences on your slide, but it's going to be significantly more talking. The oral component is always bigger than the slides, right? Because if the oral component was just reading off what was on the slides exactly as it's written, you don't really need the oral component. People can just read the slides themselves. In this portion, the introduction, you're going to talk about what your hypothesis is and what it is that you're trying to prove. So what's your topic? What exactly is your argument about that topic? What should the audience expect the rest of the presentation to be about? Your methods section comes next, and this will go over how you're going to make that case, how you're going to support your argument. Did you run a sample of your own? Did you give out surveys? Did you go through the literature and conduct a literature review? What were your research techniques, and how did you go about trying to prove your argument? That leads naturally into the results and how those tie into your main arguments, which is the next section. So you have an argument established. You've talked about how you went about doing the research to prove that argument. Next, you're going to talk about what the results of your research were. Did you find evidence to support your argument and to build that out? And what was that evidence? How did you prove the argument that you started with? Next, we're going to move into a discussion and conclusion section. So this is going to elaborate on anything that you resolved through your research in relation to your argument. Did you prove your argument exactly the way that you had it in mind? Did you create other avenues for further research? So maybe you started with a topic about success in the classroom, and you had a specific angle that you wanted to look at that through, but in the process of doing that, you identified something else, maybe the presence of technology or the absence of technology, that wasn't part of your original structure. It wasn't something that you tested in your research. So you have a conclusion based on what you've done, but you might also discuss the possibility for further research, that things that you've already done, information that you've already collected, has identified as gaps that could be explored. Now that we've established what goes where in your presentation, how to put the information that you've gathered as part of your research, how to lay that out into a presentation, we should also talk about what that presentation itself should look like in the sort of nitty-gritty details, right? So section headings, subheadings, those are going to be a larger font and usually a different color than the body text, and you can see that on my presentation here. The title for this slide is in bold, it's big, it's right at the top. It tells you as soon as we reach this slide what it is I'm going to be talking about. And then each of the subheadings below that are in a different color, and they're bold, and they emphasize the flow of the presentation that I'm about to give. You can anticipate what I'm going to talk about next, and you can see how I think of them as fitting together. Next, we want to see the body text and paragraphs in a way that's easily readable from a shared computer screen. So people are going to be watching this on YouTube, possibly on their phone, possibly at a computer. You want to make sure that your text is large and readable even on a small screen. So you don't want to pack each slide with too much information. It's much easier to spread out information over several slides and keep the text big than it is to try to explain a complicated topic from a single slide that's densely packed with text that's so small that people can't read it. We want to emphasize that accessibility angle of things. The other thing is that your background and your images should exist for a purpose. You want to add those different icons and pictures and graphs and points of data where they make the most sense and where they support the point that you're trying to make. If you have a graph or a chart or a table of information, you probably want to dedicate most of the slide to that piece of information so that it's clear what it's connected to. You also want to make sure that your background is good contrast to the text that you're using. So this is a white slide with gray text and with dark green text. If I tried to use light gray, it would become very difficult to read on a white background. You want to make sure that there's a good amount of contrast between the text itself and the background of the slide. Otherwise, your audience is going to have difficulty reading what you've typed. And so to reiterate that here, your choice of color should be deliberate, right? So we talked about having a sharp contrast between the text itself and the background of the slide. White text on black background, black text on white background, things like that where the contrast is very high. You can also use different colors, as I've done here, a dark green, to set that piece of text aside from what surrounds it. You can use any color you like, although you want to emphasize readability as you're doing so. If you use colors that are complementary to each other, you're going to emphasize that contrast, and that will make it very clear which pieces of information are distinct from one another. So our headings distinct from the body of a text, but also individual words within these paragraphs or these sentences that you have on a slide. If you want to draw attention to that word, you want to emphasize a higher contrast, making it bold, giving it an underline or italicized formatting style, and especially changing the color of it. Our eyes are drawn to things which are different. The thing that is different stands out, and we focus on that. That's why you're going to read the title of this slide, which is big, bold, and at the top first, and then your eyes will go down each of the subheadings, which are in bold and a different color, before you start reading the paragraphs themselves. One other thing to keep in mind is that the fonts that you use have a significant impact on how readable your material is. Some of the more APA approved basic types of fonts are your best options here. Times New Roman, Calibri, Source Sans Pro, Average, those are your default settings in most word processors for a reason. They're easy to read. If you start using the more creative looking fonts, some that look a little more like cursive writing or are especially thick letters, readability can suffer for that. And you want to balance readability with aesthetic pleasure when you're building your presentation. Last, title placement and size are important. The fact that that title of this slide is in bold and is significantly bigger than the text around it draws your eye to it, and that's what you want. Your title should always be bigger, should always typically be in bold to draw attention to it. Okay, some last tips before we wrap up this presentation and before finalizing your presentation as you're building it. A few things that you want to do. You want to test the readability of your text on each slide. And this is something that I try to do regularly when I'm building presentations. I always go through and I want to make sure that the text fonts are standardized between the different slides. Everything is the same size relative to each different slide. Everything is positioned on the screen in the same way. It can be distracting if your text starts in the middle of the page and then the next slide it's at the top and then the next slide it's at the bottom. Keeping things uniform throughout will make everything flow a little bit better. You also want to make sure that the text is, like I said, readable and the contrast is good and the fonts are good. And this is often something that is useful to delegate to a friend. Ask someone else to look at your slides and see if they're able to go through them and read everything that you've typed. Also, having that friend go through your presentation will help catch any issues with visual effects, the charts, the graphs, things like that. They have meaning to you because you've done the research. Does a friend who hasn't done that research see what you're trying to illustrate with that graphic? If not, it might be wise to look for other graphics that are more obvious, or to build out more explanatory text that tells the audience why that image is important, right? Also useful to have that friend just go through the entire presentation for grammar and spelling, and to use spell check as a feature. Grammarly is good as well, and Grammarly can be integrated into Google programs, including Google Slides, and we'll go through and check the spelling of words, the usage of words, and your grammar in longer sentences like I have on this page here. That's very useful. The last thing that you want is to have a basic word that's misspelled as part of your presentation that's locked in. I have had that issue on some of my slides in the past where it makes it difficult to go back and edit. PowerPoint saves your voiceover separately from the slide itself, which means that you can go back and you can correct typos in your slides. But if you're reading directly from your slides and you read out one of those typos, you then have to re-record at least that slide. And that's a lot of extra work. So just having that spell check, having that friend proofread your grammar before you go to the next stage of recording your presentation is always a good idea and is always going to save you work later. Lastly, and this is important because some of you won't have presented at conferences before and maybe haven't been to an academic conference. What you want to keep in mind as you're presenting your material, and especially as you get into the question and answer sessions that follow the presentations, is that you did this research. You are the expert in the topic that you're presenting about. Your audience members are going to ask questions to clarify what you're trying to say with your argument, but they're not going to know things that you don't necessarily. Be confident in what you've done. Be confident in the research that you've done, because you know more than the people in the room who are asking questions of you. And that should inform the way that you answer questions. Don't let questions fluster you. Lastly, we'll close by linking to some of the other resources available on the library page, these library guides, both very useful for helping you to build this presentation and to have a text-based, image-based, work at your own pace sort of set of resources that you can go back to in addition to the recording that I've presented today. If you have any questions about anything I've presented today or anything that you find in the guides, or anything at all, really, feel free to contact the library at library@tiffin.edu or me directly at gilmerjm@tiffin.edu. We check those emails very regularly and typically get back to students within a few hours a day at most. So with that in mind, good luck on your research and have a good day.